We start in 1875. By this time nearly every country in Latin America has declared independence from Portugal and Spain. At this point, Argentina and Uruguay, fueled by a growing export industry, lead Latin America's economic development. Workers in these two countries are only 25% less wealthy than their American counterparts. Mexico opens its doors to foreign investment for the first time in decades. Money pours in from the UK, France, and the US. By the turn of the century, foreign investment in Mexico rivals investment in the United States. This creates massive, but unequal growth. From 1895 to 1897, Argentina is the wealthiest country in the world, per capita. In 1901, Cuba created a constitution and finally found independence. However, they were forced to cede massive powers to the United States. And in 1903, Panama, backed, funded and protected by the United States, declares its independence from Colombia. It also cedes massive powers to the US, including control of the Panama Canal. For the past 100 years, Latin America's economy expanded based on its exports to Europe. When the world entered the First World War in 1914, Europe began demanding fewer exports, and economies of Latin America began to suffer. Many countries respond by nationalizing foreign-owned industries and social reform. Ironically, around this time, Central America begins to transition their legal system to allow for greater ownership of private property. In 1929, the world was struck by the Great Depression. Global exports crashed, having a catastrophic effect on the region. Chile, Peru, and Bolivia are on record as being the hardest hit economies in the entire world. In 1929, Argentina left the gold standard and devalued their currency, giving them a competitive edge in global markets. As a result, their experience was mild in comparison to the rest of the world. Starting in the 1930s, Latin America begins to believe that they have become too dependent on foreign trade. They start placing high tariffs on foreign goods, subsidizing and even nationalizing industries. The hope was that over time, they would build up their own industries by replacing foreign products with locally produced goods. 1943 would be a landmark year for nationalist movements in the region. Venezuela would take its first step toward nationalization of the oil industry. 50% of all profits from oil would go directly to the government. This was followed by a series of laws to increase the discovery of new oil fields. Meanwhile, Argentina would have its second coup, which would bring Juan Perón to power. Perón would enact sweeping reforms including price controls, nationalization of major industries, and would eventually close off Argentina from nearly all imports of foreign goods. By 1950, Argentina, once called the United States of South America, had a GDP per capita of just half of the country it was once compared to. And in 1952, Puerto Rico becomes a commonwealth, giving it stronger ties to the US. Starting in 1955, Argentina would stage a coup against Juan Perón. This would be the first of a number of undemocratic changes in leadership that would take place over the next 30 years. Each leader would have their own convoluted idea of how to run the economy. In 1959, Fidel Castro would lead a communist revolution and assume control in Cuba. They would ally themselves with the USSR, who would send aid and buy sugar from the Caribbean island at up to 11 times the global price. In 1960, Venezuela joins OPEC as a founding member. Tax laws incentivize American businesses to manufacture goods in Puerto Rico. The Commonwealth begins producing textiles and eventually graduates to biotechnology and petrochemical products. Starting in 1973, oil prices begin to skyrocket. And in 1976, Venezuela fully nationalizes their oil industry. Since the 1930s, industrialization programs for many Latin American countries were still planned and funded by the state. The debt piled up, and when the price of oil collapsed in 1980, so did the debt market. And in 1982, Mexico declared it could no longer pay its debts. The debt crises would spread through nearly every country in the region. The economic damage was so catastrophic that the 1980s would henceforth be known as Latin America's lost decade. The International Monetary Fund was forced to intervene with mixed results. They convinced governments to practice fiscal discipline, privatize industries and open up trade. And in the 1990s, growth returned to the area. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell. And Cuba lost its most important economic ally. In the early 90s, Chile returned to democracy and struck a balance. They created an economy marked by free trade and fiscal discipline. But that also included increased social spending. In 1997, after privatizing industries, Panama joined the World Trade Organization. And in 1999, they regained control of the Panama Canal. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq, making oil prices and Venezuela's economy soar once again. In 2008, the global financial crisis strikes and sends the price of oil into a tailspin. At this point, Venezuela is almost totally dependent on oil, as it represents 95% of the nation's total exports. And the country with the largest proved oil reserves in the world takes an economic nosedive. This brings us to present day. Puerto Rico is a semi-autonomous commonwealth of the United States. It is currently in an economic recession but is still the wealthiest territory in the Latin world. It is the third largest producer of biotechnology on the planet, and manufactures 16 of the 20 best-selling drugs in the United States. Argentina, once the wealthiest country in the world per capita, fell into a monetary crisis in 2018, yet again. Inflation reached as high as 45%, and interest rates have been hiked as high as 60%. The country is being bailed out and restructured by the IMF, once more. The Nobel-winning economist, Simon Kuznets, famously said that there are 4 types of countries: developed, undeveloped, Japan, and Argentina. Panama has the largest number of registered cargo vessels in the world. 22% of all cargo by weight is transported by Panamanian ships. The Panama Canal represents 40% of its entire GDP. Despite its wealth, it has exceptionally high, but declining inequality. By 2019, Venezuela has fallen further into economic turmoil. In 2014 inflation hit 69%, and by 2019, it rose to 2 million percent. Over 500 companies are owned by the state. Citizens have seen shortages of price-controlled products including milk, meat, rice, oil and butter, forcing many Venezuelans to eat wild fruit, and even garbage. The country has ranked number 1 on Bloomberg's Misery Index for the past 5 consecutive years. Lastly, Chile, the most economically free and stable country in South America. Its economy is both diverse and wealthy. Industries contributing substantial amounts to its GDP include mining, fisheries, tourism, finance, manufacturing and more. It has signed a vast network of free trade agreements with countries from around the world, from Colombia, to China, to the United States. And its politicians continue running on a platform of furthering this trend. Lastly, I thought it might be useful to see how Latin America compares to the rest of the world. While relatively wealthy, the average Panamanian and Chilean resident produces less than half of their American counterparts. China and South Africa are the largest economies in their respective continents, but produce less per capita than most of Latin America. And despite the humanitarian crisis in Central America and Venezuela, every country in the region has greater output per capita than Haiti. If you would like me to produce a video like this for your company, go to nobledatum.com/contact. If you would like to take a deeper dive, and get an even better understanding of Latin America's economic history, or of any other country, visit nobledatum.com/thewealthofnations. We have more videos, and even an interactive visualization, so you review any set of countries over any time period you like. And lastly, subscribe to my YouTube channel, if you would like to see more videos.